In this lesson, we're going to look at how to mask or change the IDs that we expose to the users in the front end and keep these IDs internally. Now, if you're used to working with YouTube, you would know that in YouTube, we do have these hash IDs for videos, and internally, YouTube may be using some different form or some different ID, but our videos or the videos that you actually watch come out with these hashed version of the actual IDs of the videos. So I really prefer to do that because I don't want users to know based on the ID how many records I have in the database. So to do this, I'm going to install another third-party package called Laravel HashIds. And what this package does is when we save a record in the database, it simply creates a hash version of the ID that was generated in the database. So we know that it's still going to be unique because it's just a hash of the actual ID that was created. And then when we expose the record to the front end through the API resources, instead of using the ID field, we are going to use the hash ID field to send out to the front end. But internally, we are going to create a way to resolve that to the actual ID to be able to use it internally and move things around. So let's quickly install this package. Over here in VS Code, we can just do composer require the Laravel HashID package. And that's all we need to do to get that package set up. Now to use it, if you go back to the documentation, it says all you need to do is use the trait HashID in your model, and then you can provide the options that you want to use for your hash IDs or to generate your hash IDs. So we are going to do that, but we want to add a little bit more functionality to this trait. I want to be able to resolve given any hash ID to get the actual ID. I want to create a scope that can easily search for a user using the hash ID, and I want to be able to set my options. And also I want to override what we call the get root key name, because right now when you go to a controller and you want to get a record of a particular user from a request, let's say if you go to the register user controller and you wanted to get the record of a particular user, you could directly just say user, pass the user instance there. And if you have root model binding working on your system, then you will just see that Laravel would resolve this user to the record. And by default, it uses the ID, which means that the route that you're pointing to this function would be something like user and the user. And based on that, user here would be the ID of the user, so 1. And Laravel would use that parameter to resolve the user from the database and return it. Now that is a default, just using the ID. But in this case, because we want to use the hash IDs in the front end, I want to override this root key name function so that it will use the hash ID field to retrieve a user. So we're going to see how that works in a moment. So if we're to use that package to generate a hash ID, the first thing we need to do is add a hash ID field to our database. So every record that needs a hash ID would need to have a hash ID field. So this is going to be a string, and we'll call it hash ID. And you can override this, but I'm going to leave it to hash ID. And that should be nullable, because when the user record or when the database record is being created, the hash ID is not known. It's only after it's been created, then the ID is taken and hashed and saved in this field. So initially, this field will be nullable for every record that we create in the database. But we don't have to do anything manually. It will resolve itself using the created events in Laravel. And if we wanted to use that trait here, we'll directly just call use hash ID and pull that namespace in. Now, this is an easy way to do it, but I'm not going to use this method. I'm going to create another trait that has more properties in it, more functionality in it, and use that in my models instead. So under my app directory, I'm just going to create a subfolder called traits. And in here, I'm going to create a new trait called with hash id.php. And again, that is going to be a regular PHP trait. So let's generate a namespace for it. And we'll call this trait with hash ID. And in this trait, I'm going to use the hash ID trait from the package that we just installed. And then I can override the methods that I need in here and add new functionality. And in my regular models, I would then use the customize with hash ID trait. Okay, so we can now override things here and have all the data that we need, all the customization that we need for the hash ID. The first thing that we want to do is override a method called public function get hash ID options. And this returns a hash ID options. And this again comes from the package that we just installed. So we have a class called hash ID options, which is where we specify the options or customize the options for our hash IDs. So we need to return hash ID options create. And here we can now provide the options. So save hash ID 2, and this is the field that will contain the hash ID in our model. In this case, we called it hash ID. If we go back to the migration that we just updated here, we call the field hash ID. So if you wanted to change this and call it something else, make sure you put it in here. Otherwise, it will be looking for a hash ID by default. Then we want to set the minimum hash length, so the minimum characters that you want in the hash ID. And I'll just say we want a minimum of 10 characters in the hash ID, all right? Then another option that I want to set here is the option to set alphabet. And by default, it will create a hash which includes uppercase characters, lowercase characters, and numbers from 0 to 9. So it can be a mixture of these numbers and letters. But I want it to only have lowercase letters. So I don't want to have any uppercase letters in the hash ID that is generated. For that, we can just provide the alphabet that we want to use to generate our hashes. So here we just want it to be able to give A to Z lowercases or 0 to 9 in characters. So it will be a mixture of these without any uppercases. So again, these are options that we use to override how the hash ID is being created. And if we come over to our user model, we don't have any warnings. So we've implemented the minimum options required to use this package. In fact, if we go to the hash ID or the options here, you can see all the options that you can customize. The type is the type of ID that you have in the database. By default, is the incremental integer. You can change the field. So in this case, we're just going with hash ID. The alphabet, which is what we just overwrote here, by default, it can use uppercases, but we don't want to use uppercases. So there's all these options that you can use to customize how your hash IDs are being created. And then it will use that definition to overwrite and to hash your regular IDs in the database. Now, that is the first method, and that is a generic method that all packages or all modules using this trait will have to implement. But I also want to write a couple of functions here. The first one is I want to write a scope that will allow me to retrieve a user based on the hash ID very easily. And that is very easy in Laravel. So here I'll just say public function scope hash ID, and that will take the builder instance, so the Eloquent builder instance, which is a query, and it will take a string, which is the hash ID that we want to use to query the user from the database. And here we just return builder, where again this is a regular Eloquent query where the hash ID equals hash ID. Okay, which means that when we query a user from the database, we can directly say user has a hash ID and provide a hash ID here, and it will translate it to the scope. Then we want to be able to retrieve the actual ID of the user based on the hash ID that is provided in the front end. So here, let's just say public static function. I'll make this static function so we don't have to instantiate anything. We just need to call this method on any class that is using the hash ID. And I'm going to call it getID. And let's just say string. And here we'll pass the hash ID. And we just need to return static. Again, we are calling static here because this is a static function, and we can't use this because we are using a static function here. So static hash ID equals the hash ID that we passed through, and we want to get the first record and return the ID of that first record. Here we are already using the scope that was created at the top. So we are just saying user, where the hash ID equals whatever hash ID we provide, and we're getting the first record, so we only return one record, and here we return the actual ID of that record. And let's assume that somebody passes through a hash ID that doesn't exist. Then in this case, we're probably going to get an error here because we are trying to access ID of a record that doesn't exist. To fix this and to be on the safe side, we're just going to use null safety, which is a feature that was introduced in PHP 8 by putting a question mark here, so that if the record doesn't exist, if we don't find any record in the database that contains the hash ID that we passed through, then we'll just return null without an error. But if it does exist, then we'll return the ID. Okay, so that's what we're going to do here. And wherever we have a hash ID and want to get the actual ID, we simply call the getID method from this class to return that hash ID. Then, as I mentioned, we need to override the get root key name, because by default, Laravel uses the ID field to automatically retrieve a record from the database based on the route parameter. But here we want to override that because we will be sending the hash ID from the front end and not the actual ID. So we want to be able to override that and have Laravel use the hash ID field instead. So let's just call this public function get root key name. And here we just return a string, which is the field that we want Laravel to use to resolve route parameters by default. So these are the functions that we are going to use. And in every model that we create, we're just going to have the model use this trait, which means that every model we create has to have a hash ID field, and that those IDs will be automatically hashed in the database in that field, and we can use it going forward. To test this, let's go back to our user record or user registration. And in fact, let's start with the user resource, where we are returning the actual ID. We said in the front end, we want to actually return the hash ID. So the users or whoever is accessing this data in the front end should only see the hash ID. And if we go back here, PHP artisan, migrate fresh, go back to the database, we should see that the user record now should have a hash ID field, which is what we define. And let's go and register this user again, send that through. And the ID that comes back is actually the hash ID and not the actual ID of the user. So whoever is looking at this data from the front end should not know that this is user with ID number 1. They just see this hash, which is what we are storing in the database here. And we can directly resolve that to the actual user. In fact, if we wanted to test this to be sure that these methods are working, we can just say actual ID, and this is just a test. We'll remove it later on. We can just say user get ID this hash ID. Okay, remember we did create a get ID in the trait, which is a method that resolves the hash ID to the actual ID of the user. So let's go back, refresh our database, and create that record again to see what we get in the front end. So if we do that, we see that the actual ID is resolved to ID number 1. And so we can use that function internally to resolve every hash ID to the actual ID of the user to do things in the database. But as far as the front end goes, we don't need that information so that people will not know what the actual ID of the record is.